When we look at the challenge in Ephesians to let no unwholesome language come out of your mouth, only what's helpful for building others up according to their need. See, communication is not based upon what I need in this moment. Communication is based upon the need of the other person. We look at that. And if the other person is speaking in hyperbole as an expression of their emotions, they don't need correction, right? They need compassion.
Thanks for joining us on The Glass House, a podcast hosted by Lifeway. We're having important conversations with ministry leaders and their spouses in order to reach and encourage you in the ministry right where you are.
These conversations have been reaching thousands of people all over the world, and we are so grateful. Could we ask you, if you're enjoying this podcast, would you leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to the show? It helps others find us and keeps the ministry going.
Well, today on the show, we decided to bring something that we've struggled with, our own stuff in marriage. You know, pastor and pastor's wife and ministry leaders and their spouses, they go through stuff. And Lindley and I have recently realized something about our own marriage that we think it might be helpful to talk about out loud on this episode, which is our kryptonite. Angie Elkins is back on the show to help us talk through it. And we've always been blessed to have Adam Mason. He's back to help give some insight into what your marriage kryptonite might be as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is different for everybody, but some of the things we discuss in this episode are marriage expectations. How realistic are they? Where do we even get these expectations from? Who sets this standard? We bring all those things into this show.
And one of the things I love hearing from listeners is that episode made me feel a little less alone in my struggle. So we hope that our pain and our struggle will be encouraging to you as you deal with your own stuff in marriage.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about the kryptonite of marriage. And I think if the listener is tuning in right now and they think, what is the kryptonite in my marriage? They may all kind of arrive at a different place. But what we've decided here, well, why don't you tell us? What do you think your kryptonite is?
Well, first of all, I think the kryptonite of marriage is as true for non-ministry oriented families as it is for church staff people. So this is one of those topics that applies to everybody. But Lindley and I believe that the kryptonite of our marriage has been hiding.
I agree. I mean, I think that we have talked about so many things, and most of the time you hear people talk about communication being the kryptonite, but I think even below that is, why are there communication problems? And typically that's because somebody is hiding from the other one and doesn't want to be exposed, doesn't want to be found out, and not even bad things, but just, feelings of insecurity or things like that.
It's hard to bring the full weight of ourselves into a relationship. John Eldridge talks about that in Wild at Heart, bringing the full weight of who you are. And it has been my greatest temptation in our marriage to hide my true self from Lindley, what I'm really dealing with. And it creates a disconnection in our marriage, which only causes this icy silence to begin. It's just kind of a train wreck waiting to happen. And so we wanted to start talking about this because we continue to struggle with it, even though we're hosting a show about emotional health. It's a real challenge for us.
Well, and I think for me, I don't hide from Ben. In fact, I'm a challenger personality, but I can tend to hide from other people. I mentioned this before, that I can be really authentic, but not vulnerable. And so, I'll hide what I'm feeling from other people pretty easily.
I think vulnerability in general is difficult for most people, maybe even all, but especially for men. So talk a little bit about that, Ben. Like, how did you even discover that was a problem for you?
I do think that men struggle with the superhero syndrome, and that we really want our wives to think that we're made of steel and that nothing bothers us, and that we're the tough one, and we'll make sure we keep our chins up around here. But what happens when we're the one struggling? What happens when I'm the one that's emotionally unstable? And recently, I had like an emotional meltdown night when it just kind of all fell apart for me. A lot of things I'd been storing up, and Lindley and I had conflict around it because she's not sure in those moments how to respond to me. And I think there's a lot of couples that struggle with this. Like, what do you do when your spouse is in a bad place?
Well, and what was confusing to me that night was that some of what he was saying was not true. I mean, like I used this expression, it wasn't ringing the bell of truth. And so then I feel really torn with my personality. I kind of want to talk him out of it because like, you're not even perceiving this correct. But when I didn't that night, but that was really hard for me as well because I felt inauthentic to myself because I was just listening to him ramble on about something that was not true. And so I was torn within myself of like, well, what do I do here? Like, how do I respond to this? Do I just let him talk and continue to believe what he feels is the truth?
Yeah, I think that's hard. I think because, when our guys kind of let go and become vulnerable, that's great. Like we're excited about that. But then what do you do with that vulnerability, right? Do you embrace it? Do you, it can be tricky. And women, as you said, wives can be honest, but not always vulnerable. Talk about the difference.
Well, for me, I'm a really opinionated person. And so I don't have a problem if you were to say, do you like this or this better? I mean, I would be very forthright in saying, I like this better. Or would you rather have this or that? And that's honesty. I don't hide behind, well, whatever you want. That's not my personality. But when it comes to when people would say, how are you doing? A lot of times I would just say, I'm fine, and I wasn't being passive aggressive, but that's not the truth. Like I wasn't really feeling fine, but I just didn't want to get into it. And so I just thought, well, I'll just hold it in and maybe not share what I really feel because it is, that goes back to that safe people picker too, of like, I don't know exactly who to share with. And so then I would just tend to keep it in.
So when we're at home, that should be safe, right?
Mm-hmm. I can give you a real story.
Yeah.
When we were planning a church, we were having a very difficult time finding a space. And a church can't meet without a space. And I was knocking on every school door I could, and people would not talk to me. And I came home one day about the 8th time of being rejected by a school. And I came into the kitchen, and I'll never forget, I don't cry very much. I just don't. I just started weeping in the kitchen because I felt so powerless to fix the situation. And Lindley and I, in that moment, like deeply connected because she felt like for the first time I was being honest about how I was feeling about the church. It's been moments of my fragility or my willingness to show weakness that has really drawn us together, and yet everything within me resists that.
Yeah.
So that's why it's hard for me to even talk about, because logically in my head, I know if I can be proactive with her, if I can initiate conversations around her, it always goes better, but I'm almost always the last one to talk about hurt feelings. So Lindley begins to feel like she's the one that's, always being bossy or assertive by forcing us to talk about it. And then that creates friction.
The thing that made that so special to me was that you came in and you weren't piggybacking off of my feelings. You just came in and were honest with me. And so at that point, I felt tender towards you because I knew that you were really, really hurting inside, and you just needed me to listen and have compassion with you instead of trying to fix something.
You mentioned we want our wives to think we're superheroes and we've got it all together. That's one reason. But I think there are other reasons we hide too. One thing we've talked about is oftentimes I think our husbands hide because they want to protect us. Has that been your experience?
Absolutely. I've justified in my mind a lack of vulnerability because it's better she not know. Let her just continue to go on in her universe where things are happy right now. I don't want to sour that by sharing this really ugly email that I just got. So I'll just walk around and act like I'm okay when I'm really not okay, which is an illusion. I'm not okay. I'm in the room, but my head's somewhere else. She knows it. She's been married to me long enough to know when I'm present but not present. And so it's like this charade that's going on, and it's only a matter of time before it hits the fan. When you go beyond the surface and start like really probing into what's going on in our relationship, that to me is, okay, if we're going to explore feelings in this way, then I have some I'm going to share too. And again, I think that is, it robs you of the ability to share stuff on your heart in a really healthy way.
Well, I think one thing we've said is it robs me the ability to grow emotionally healthy as well. When you would come, if you would come to me, And there have been a few occasions like this that you've come and said, I don't think what you said is true. Well, those typically have gone fine because I've kind of listened to you. I mean, we have an example recently. We were at a party with a couple of people, and I was talking to some ladies and just, trying to play tough, and was like, I don't care what they think. I don't care what people think. Well, he was listening to that, and he was very respectful of me there. But we got in the car, and you said, I don't think that that's true. You actually are a very caring person, and you do care what people think about you, and not in an unhealthy way. And I was really convicted by it. And I actually went back to those two people and said, I think I was trying to play a tougher game than what I really am. I am still human. And so that was a moment for me because you did address it like in the moment, in real time. I was able to, I received it, and I was able to go back and clear that up versus, well, 4 weeks ago you said this. And then it's weird to go back to people.
Yeah. So the hiding actually just creates us hoarding in a way. We're just kind of hoarding our resentment and keeping it in there. And then it comes out all sideways and it's
explosive.
Terrible. Yeah. Explosive. It sounds to me like, Lindley, you're hiding behind that tough exterior. Yeah. So that's what he's calling out in you,
Sure.
right? Yeah. So we're all hiding.
Right.
We're just doing it in different ways. And
right.
I think that's fascinating and interesting.
It's just in our DNA that when there's problems going on inside of us, the sin inside of us wants to cover it up and hide and not show people what's really in there. Mark Twain has a quote that every man has a dark side that he doesn't want anyone to see. Every man is like the moon in that way. And I think I have pieces of me and feelings I have inside that I really would rather her not know. I don't want her to see those sides of me, but it is part of who I am. And it's hard to become that exposed with somebody. And that's why I know I've shared this with you. Sometimes I do fear Lindley. I know it's hard for husbands to talk about that, but we fear our wives. We don't want them to know. What if they know all this about me? What's going to happen then?
Yeah, our counselor is the one who introduced that term to us. And he said, Ben, it sounds like you are afraid of Lindley. And of course, I immediately took offense to that because it felt like, well, I'm not physically harming him. I'm not doing these things. But really, you can explain how you felt in that, but it was just such an interesting term. When he said that to you, you're afraid of her.
Yeah, I think we all have brokenness in our life. I think somewhere along the way, I learned that if I can get approval from people, then I'm safe with them. And then over the years, because of different things that happen in my life, relationships change and become unstable. And so you learn that there's always going to be at least one person that's going to be there for you through it all. And that person's been Lindley for my whole life. So I really need us to be okay. More than I'm willing to express on most days. Everything can be going wrong in my career. Everything can be going wrong with everything else. But if Lindley and I are solid, everything feels okay. Relationally, I'm obviously talking about not speaking about relationship with the Lord, but that relationship is so important that it becomes a kind of codependence that doesn't allow me to confront her on issues that need to be confronted. Adam, Lindley and I have talked about the kryptonite of our marriage has been hiding, but every marriage is different. You speak to a lot of couples. How do you help couples identify what their kryptonite is?
Yeah, I love the concept you guys are discussing today about the kryptonite of marriage. There's a little bit of a false base that you're starting with, though, because when I think of kryptonite, the obvious analogy is to Superman.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so to say that marriage has a kryptonite means that we're trying to develop the super marriage. And maybe that's the first kryptonite of a marriage, is this unrealistic expectation
That's good.
of what we can be. So for the couple to begin to look, first of all, of what are our expectations? That's the first thing you want to explore. What is my personal expectation walking into this marriage? And what's the expectation that we have a couple have of what our marriage should look like? And that changes over the different life stages of the marriage. Number one would be expectation. Number two, the second question would be, what are the strongholds within my own heart? When do I respond reactively? When do I respond defensively? And then how can I invite my spouse into the battle for that part of my heart that I might be set free from that stronghold that's there? Because just because I experienced a particular childhood or previous relationship doesn't mean that I have to live in perpetuation in that stronghold. I can find freedom from that. And then thirdly, how is my identity being expressed in this relationship? Can I embrace who I really am? And am I willing to let my spouse see who I really am? Or am I in a pattern because of fear, insecurity, shame, not embracing who I am, and therefore not allowing my spouse to see who I really am?
That's really good. One of the things that's happened in our counseling journey is I've sometimes been surprised by the things that have deeply wounded you.
Mm-hmm.
It's caused me to think, okay, what about that statement hit you so deeply? What's going on in your life or your story that I'm completely unaware of, that is such a volatile or hurtful statement?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an invitation to get to know really what's going on in your own heart, your own battle.
Mm-hmm.
Replace criticism with curiosity. So there's a tendency to respond with criticism when we feel like our spouse is overreacting to something, right? To be defensive, to be critical, to move into an attack mode. But if we would instead pause and move towards them with a holy curiosity about, tell me more about what triggered within you when I said that. What was the meaning that you attached to that?
That's really good advice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Adam, what do you think about the subject? Do spouses tend to hide from each other?
I think the first thing that we have to say regarding hiding is that hiding is not unique to marriage. And when ultimately we're hiding, we're not really hiding from our spouse. When we look at the scripture, the first example of hiding that we find is Adam and Eve hid from God in the garden, from the Father. And prior to that time, it says in scripture that Adam and Eve were naked and felt no shame, right? And so we find an environment where there's no shame, where there's no fear. Sin enters into the picture, and suddenly man and woman both are ashamed and afraid, and they begin the process of hiding. And we see that throughout Scripture. Now, some hiding is good as we follow the Old Testament narrative. You know, David hid from King Saul. But some of the hiding is not good. When the prophet Elijah runs and hides, or after defeating the prophets of Baal, hides out of fear from that perspective. And so we see hiding consistently a representation of ultimately a fear and shame related to God, related to our relationship with God, related to a feeling of disappointing God. And I think in the marriage relationship, we're afraid we're going to get called out. There is nobody in my life who determines that I'm walking in the flesh faster than my wife Charlene does. And ultimately, when I pull back, it's because there's something within my heart, something within my mind that's caused me to pull back, and there's a fear of being called out. Now, sometimes that sin that's in my life, and I don't want to admit that I'm being prideful or I'm being stubborn or I want things my way, and in this moment, I'm not being considerate. Sometimes, though, it's that fear of insecurity, you know, the fear that I'm not the man that I want to project to other people that I am. So I don't think it's unique to marriage. I don't think it's unique to men or women. I think we both hide. We find the origin of that back in the garden. And ultimately, it comes because of not accepting our identity in Christ, who God made us to be, and not accepting his forgiveness for our sin, feeling that we've got to, as Adam and Eve did, we have to hide from him or from others who represent him.
That's really good. I mean, when you are working with couples, and this seems to be a problem for them, how do you get them to even understand or identify that they're hiding? I mean, you know, I think there are things, probably even with Ben and I, that we are hiding from each other and maybe subconsciously don't even realize it. And so is there a way that you help work through this situation?
I look for the vulnerability. You know, that as you're visiting with an individual or as you're working with a couple facilitating communication, you look at the depth of the communication that's there. Is the communication taking them to a place a vulnerability, or are they saying what they're expected to say? Are they saying what they've said before? Are they taking it to a deeper place? And where there's that lack of vulnerability, there's going to be the presence of hiding, if you will.
Adam, I think Lindley's spot on. She normally detects it in our marriage first that I'm being evasive or withdrawn or just shallow. And I'm normally defensive when she calls it out, like, hey, I'm just busy, or man, why do we always have to talk about hard things? Why can't we just talk about sports or whatever? And I'm really just not wanting to go there because I'm afraid it's going to be a painful conversation and I don't want pain. So one of the things that counseling has taught me is teaching me is, be careful, this is present tense. It's just how to say a statement that isn't qualified. Like I might say something like, I think I might be struggling with self-doubt, which is a really soft way to say, hey, I haven't told you this, but I've been having terrifying feelings that I'm not measuring up. And so it's like learning a new language for me. So maybe there's a listener out there and he's a pastor and he knows he's shallow with his wife and he just doesn't know how to say vulnerable things. Like, to Lindley's point, like, what would be some practical tips to help couples maybe go a little deeper into the feelings realm?
Or recognize it. Even just recognize that maybe they're not going deep. So I'll give an example. Ben and I have a continual conversation that plays in our house of where I will ask him, tell me a feeling, tell me something deeper. And he'll say to me, I hope this is okay to say, I don't know anyone who communicates more than us. And I say, well, communication as in calendaring, talking about what needs to happen each on the daily basis of who goes where. But, what about like a deeper communication? How do we get to that place? So I think that's a really big struggle for us. And I mean, I have to believe that that's a struggle for other people, or I want to.
Part of it is the way that we interpret what's being said and what's happening, right? So when you said to him, tell me something deeper, you gave him an invitation. You said to him, I would like to be in a deeper place in our connection. And he responded as if you had given him a challenge. He responded defensively.
Right.
Right. I don't know of anybody who communicates more than I do.
Or we
defensive
do,
response. Yeah. Pardon?
We do, yeah. I mean, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so you've got a rejection of an invitation. And so that starts down a negative spiral, right? You feel rejected because you rejected your invitation. He feels, once again, he's being falsely accused of not meeting the needs that are there, and it becomes this negative spiral. It's all about breaking the connection, breaking the intimacy even further that's there. And for us as men, particularly, to deal with our insecurity and to be willing to be vulnerable, to be willing to acknowledge what's really going on. And Ben, you said that oftentimes you avoid that out of fear, right? Fear of pain that's there. Larry Crabb, who we lost recently in the Christian counseling world, made a quote that stuck with me for many years. And it was, the choice that we have in life is not to be afraid, not to be hurt, or to be hurt. That the choice that we have is how we're going to be hurt. Is it the fear of being alone, or the hurt of being alone, or the hurt of being known?
That's good.
So we're not avoiding pain. We can never feel fully accepted unless we're fully known. And so that fear of being rejected lasts as long as our defensiveness lasts. So we're making a choice in that moment of what we think is the lesser pain. In reality, there's no deeper pain than the pain of being alone, right? Because even our Father said when we were created, it's not good for man to be alone. And so Satan wants to step in and corrupt that and try to convince us that, no, there's something worse than being alone, which is phenomenal, right? Because when we look at the entire creation narrative, there's only one time that God creates something and says it's not good. So the first time in history, recorded history, that God says something's not good related to the creation narrative, he says it's not good for man to be alone. And somehow Satan wants to twist that and convince us, no, it's better for you to be alone than to be known.
Well, Lindley and I had this conversation recently about interpretation, and I'd like to unpack that just a little bit further. We fall into seasons in our marriage where whenever there is a statement that could be interpreted as positive or negative, I'll hear something from her and I'll immediately assume that she means that negatively. So she might say, tell me something deep. What I hear is, you're a shallow person. That's a brokenness in my own receptivity of the message. And so much, I think, of our marriage struggle has been what's going on in the interpretation realm. Could you talk about that a little bit, about just becoming aware of those negative interpretations and how to deal with that? Because I think that contributes to the hiding significantly.
Well, I would agree. In psychobabble, we would call those tapes that we've recorded, or neural pathways in the brain that are being triggered. In the Bible and the Scripture, we simply call those strongholds. Right? A stronghold of thinking, something that interferes with us walking in truth. And so that tape that's in your mind, and ultimately you've given power to the voice of Satan, the accuser of the brethren, in that moment, who takes Lindley's words, which are an invitation, and you hear that as an accusation.
Absolutely.
Right. In that moment, she's not your partner, she's your adversary.
Yep. Which makes me want to hide from her because I can't trust her.
Right. Exactly. And so to do that spiritual battle, right? The Scripture tells us in 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5, that the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. The weapons we fight with have divine power to tear down strongholds, vain imaginings, and everything that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, by holding captive every thought, making it obedient to Christ. And so to engage in that process of holding those thoughts captive, of when you have that reaction, to be able to catch yourself and say, why am I reacting to this? That even if she were attacking you as a godly man, your response needs to be a godly response back to her. And we have to recognize that when we respond out of that defensiveness, out of that little bit of anger, there's that edge, where we're drawing our sword, right, in that moment, that's not a godly response. And there was nothing ungodly about her answer or about her question. So why would we want to have an ungodly response? And that's when we see, okay, there's a spiritual battle here that is a part of our emotional battle and our cognitive battle, that Satan knows what our Achilles tendons are, what our personal kryptonite is, in the language of the particular podcast that you're doing. That he knows what our individual kryptonite is, and he takes advantage of that. He exploits that. And for us to hold captive every thought. Now, holding captive every thought is not this new activity that we have to begin. We naturally, by God's design, hold captive every thought. That's not the new part of the verse. If I were to tell you, Ben, you are the smartest man I've ever met. I love the vision that you're casting for Lifeway. The vision that you have for Lifeway is just phenomenal. I love the interactions that we have. What's going on in the back of your mind? There's two things that are happening, right? One is you're feeling a little puffed up, right?
I like it. Keep going.
Yeah. But there's another side of you that doesn't believe it, right?
Yeah. You don't know the full story kind of thing.
Yeah. You're discounting it. So you're automatically holding captive the thought, and you're checking it up against the standard already. That's not the new part of the verse. The new part of the verse is making it obedient to Christ. That's the new part. When people look at that and they think, oh my goodness, I can't hold every thought captive. That would be exhausting. Well, we're doing that already. That's not the new part. The new part is, what do we compare it to? What's the standard it has to meet in order for us to accept it? And your standard is you're trying to use it to help you heal some woundedness that's there. And you're listening to it, and it doesn't make the woundedness go away, so it can't be completely true. So to engage more completely in that process, to try to more completely walk in the Spirit, to be aware of what our vulnerabilities are, to be aware of what our Achilles tendon or our kryptonite is and how Satan exploits that, and to be willing to expose that to our spouse and ask our spouse to intercede into that battle with us with prayer.
So, Adam, one thing that we wanted to talk to you about is that Ben and I fall into this trap of not knowing how to respond when our spouse is in a bad place. I think he and I both have a lot of challenger in us. And so I don't think we even have the tools to understand how to empathize with them. We kind of just think, okay, how long are you going to be in this pity party? How long are you going to self-pity? Which is all completely unhelpful. There's nothing worse that you want to hear when you're in a bad place and someone says, hey, can you snap out of it? And so I think that, listener aside, we could use some advice in this of how do we respond when is the right time to challenge a spouse?
It's something that I personally have some experience with. I'm human as well. My wife has had multiple sclerosis, and has battled that for many, many years. And there are times when she gets despondent and, I just want her to snap out of that. Right. And the first thing I do when I find us in that place is I pay attention to what's going on within my own heart. What's my motivation here? And 9 times out of 10, and it's probably 100% if I was really being honest, my biggest concern is what it's going to require of me if she doesn't snap out of this, and how difficult it's going to be. And so I want to fix her and I don't want to fix her out of compassion, to be perfectly honest. Most of the time that I want to fix her to make my life easier. So the first thing I have to do is to do my own battle inside and say, okay, God, don't let me approach her from this perspective of I want to fix her to make my life easier. Help me to get your vision for her in this moment. And what would it look like as a man of godly strength to move towards her in a way that speaks to her soul, speaks to her spirit? What does she need from me? And I know that the first thing that she needs from me is just my presence in the situation. She just needs to know that I'm there, but in a way that's different than most men like to be there. She needs to know that I'm there, not just physically, but she needs to hear words from me. Now, it's easier for me to be there and to be present physically. And frequently this happens at night when we're lying down, for me to roll over closer to her, for me to scratch her back, for me to rub her arm. I'm here with you, but she needs something deeper than that from me in that moment. Ultimately, she's in a battle, and she's in an emotional battle. She's in a spiritual battle, and she needs for me to step into that battle for her. It's not arresting her from her self-pity. It's not challenging her to look at the positive things in life. It's to step into that battle with her. So the first thing I have to do is begin to pray for her and pray for me in that situation. God, give me the words to say in this moment. How can I say something here, not that's going to be helpful, but something that's going to be powerful, and step into this battle with her? Sometimes it's silence, and it's just continuing to stroke and to say, I have no idea what it's like to be carrying the burden that you've been carrying for the number of years without any realistic hope, apart from a miracle of God, that it's going to get better. That in reality, this is the best it's ever going to get for you. And it's going to continue to decline. And boy, when I start thinking like that, then the compassion kicks in, and I begin to weep on the inside, if not on the outside. Yeah, and I become, rather than frustrated by her struggle, I become humbled and amazed by her strength of engaging in the battle that she's been engaging in. It changes everything for me. And it's not about making my life easier in that moment.
What do you do, though, when your spouse is saying things that aren't consistent with reality and you want to correct the false narrative?
You asked the question, what would correcting the false narrative do? Yeah, is that truly being helpful, right? When we look at the challenge in Ephesians to let no unwholesome language come out of your mouth, only what's helpful for building others up according to their need.
Good.
See, communication is not based upon what I need in this moment. Communication is based upon the need of the other person. We'll look at that. And if the other person is speaking in hyperbole as an expression of their emotions, they don't need correction, right? They need compassion.
I'll give you a test case. We were walking last week. Lindley was explaining to me how she wanted to respond to a difficult situation in her life. I began to get anxious about what she was saying and immediately began to coach her to soften her approach.
It went well. Right. I mean, I am never in denial of, I have a really sharp tongue, quick temper. I can be really rude with him. And so when these things happen, it can explode. But I think that where we're trying to grow and where personally I'm really praying through is how can I love him in ways that are important to him? And so when we just were going round and round, and finally I just said, hey, here are some things that I know that are important to you. It's important to you that I speak kindly when I can. It's important to you that you like to have your back scratched. I mean,
Amen.
There's, I said, so here are some things that I'm going to work on in the next few days so that we can redeem, this lost day of arguing. And he did the same thing, and it came to a soft place. But we just can get so explosive so quick, and it's scary.
Right. So it sounds like you didn't really resolve it. It sounds like you called a truce by offering some peace gifts to each other.
Mm-hmm. I think that's true. I mean,
a good way to describe it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that we had to get to a place of just saying, okay, we've got to move forward. So what can we do to move forward if we're not going to agree on what's happening?
And that's wise. Some arguments we don't resolve, and we have to just either sit in those or to move forward. And you guys chose with wisdom to move forward. And now you want to look at that pattern and see that you don't repeat that
Correct.
pattern,
Mm-hmm.
right? To realize that once there's been a challenge, and now this is a battle that I have to win. And so I'll pull out whatever weapons of war that I need to try to shore up my side so I can win this battle. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, nobody wins.
I don't know why I put a wall around my inner life. I've tried to think about that. The other night we were looking through some old photographs, and there was a picture of me and my dad. And I just instantly felt like a deep level of sadness because my dad and I are not close, and I've always wanted us to be close, and we're not. And I didn't want to talk about it. It's just hard to put it into words. But I know I need to. And I think I speak on behalf of a lot of people who, like, you have all these thoughts and inner feelings, and you just don't know what to do with them. And Lindley just seems so free and so able to speak that language of hurt and to get all that out. And it's so hard for me. Like, I want to put that away because I'm not wanting to deal with that right now. Maybe someday I'll bring that out to play. And when I do that, like what I just shared, like, it creates affection between Lindley and I, but it's hard for me to do that.
Well, even then, I mean, I'm tearing up hearing you talk about that because I know it's a huge wound, but I know very little about it. And we just don't have a relationship with his side of the family. And we just kind of keep it at that level. I don't understand the depths of it. Like, I'm longing to hear what is going on in your heart about that. But, it's almost like off limits territory.
I think it goes back to what we said in the beginning. Just vulnerability is hard and it doesn't feel good. But I know that one of the things you guys have learned as you've been in counseling over these past couple of years is that facing the hard is what brings the good.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we face the hard of not hiding as we move forward? Have you found any practices? I know you're still working through it, which is part of the reason we're here, just to kind of be raw. But what are some of the practices you found One that's coming to mind for me is Kyle Hoover on a previous episode of the podcast talked about pulling his car off on his way home and looking at his feelings wheel so that he really had a conversation starting point with his wife to talk about what his day was like. I think that's a great practice. Have you found any others?
Yeah. I mean, for me, years and years ago, we read a book by Jimmy Evans, and in there he talked about proactive, reactive, and radioactive communication. And I think when we are proactive with communication, it almost always goes so much better than the reactive that turns into radioactive. And so for us, that's been a practice of, if you can say, I feel hurt before it turns into a fight, or when he said to me, I don't think that was true what you were saying to those ladies. So he was proactively saying that instead of waiting for a fight later on and then saying, and by the way, what you said then was not true. And so, I think that for me, in so many instances, if he's proactive in communicating with me, it just diffuses everything. I'm going to be home late or whatever. All of those things, if I just know it ahead of time, then it just makes it a little easier.
Another thing that we've learned that's been really helpful is to just call it a bad day. It's really been helpful.
It's allowed, right?
Just say, hey, I'm having a bad day. And tomorrow I'm going to be better, but it's just a day. And it almost always is. Like even the other night when we had that situation happen, like I just went to bed and the next morning I came in and apologized because I knew I was being a jerk the night before. I just was having a bad day. As Lindley and I have gotten more used to that language, it's given us a little bit more freedom to say, hey, I'll give you some space. It's a bad day because we're human and we have really good days and we have really bad days. But that's given me more freedom when we have conflict to be okay. Say, okay, tomorrow will be better. This is a bad day. Adam, let's talk a little bit more about tearing those walls down that we build up and make ourselves alone and isolated from others. If you're talking to a person or maybe even a ministry couple who is doing that, what are practical steps to start letting those walls fall?
So when you begin to lower the walls, when you intentionally make this decision that I'm going to let Lindley in and I'm going to be vulnerable, what's the thing that you have to do to make that happen?
I have to speak completely truthfully and not disguise it with soft words or to say the thing that's expected. And that's very difficult for me.
How do you make that decision? What takes place in your mind to get you to that place?
I think I reached the point where being alone is so much more painful than just being known. I count the cost. Like I'm either going to continue to live in complete isolation and handle this by myself, or I'm going to have to let her in and let the chips fall where they may when she knows how I really feel.
And I would suggest, rather than that cognitive scale and balance that you just mentioned, that there's actually an element of brokenness in that for you. There's an element of brokenness that says, I don't want to do this because I'm really afraid of this. But at the same time, I realize this is the only way I can get what I really need, or it's the only way I can truly be obedient to God, or whatever it is that you tell yourself in that moment. There's a letting go. There's a brokenness that's there. There's a yielding that's there. There's a humility that's there. And you step into that. And so it's a matter of finding that brokenness and not avoiding it. But for very practical, I want to walk every day in a brokenness before the Lord. That is the way that I walk in the image of my Maker. And so when I'm working with a couple and I'm trying to facilitate that process, the first thing that I work through is forgiveness. Okay. What is it that you need to do to forgive this individual? The next thing that I work through is I have them take a look at themselves. And essentially, I want them to come to an understanding that they're not an easy person to live with. Because none of us are easy people to live with.
Correct.
Right? So when we get to that place of being an easy person, or understanding that we're not an easy person to live with, then we start to develop some humility. We start to develop some brokenness. We start to develop some compassion. That deeper forgiveness kicks in, where we truly release what's there. Similar to what I was talking about happens with Charlene and I when I began to look at her situation and try to see her through God's eyes. And she goes from being my adversary to being my hero in that moment. And to look at that, to understand that humility, that brokenness, that confession before the Lord, which leads to a compassion and a deeper forgiveness and a desire to come alongside and support my spouse.
The crazy thing about it is every time I've spilled the beans, she's completely unsurprised. Yeah, I knew that. I knew you were struggling with that. I was just waiting for you to tell me, right?
Basically.
So we think we're keeping it a secret. Our spouse really knows most of what's going on, but just can't get us to talk about it.
We are not the enigma that we think we are.
Correct. So maybe that's a step for someone listening, is just to admit that my spouse or the people around me who know me best, they see this. This isn't going to come as a surprise to them. So why don't we just talk about it? Because then we can get it out in the open.
But we don't want that. We want to be special.
What do you mean?
We don't want to be like everybody else. You know, Lindley can make that assumption about you because that's a human characteristic. But in our struggle for significance, we want to be special. We want to be unique. We want to be different. Satan steps in and twists that and tells us that our uniqueness is in our shamefulness, which is one of those strongholds that many of us struggle. Where many of us struggle. But that's not our uniqueness. Our uniqueness is in the way that we uniquely reflect the image of God in our life. So we all reflect the same image, but we reflect it differently. You know, God is infinite, so there are an infinite number of expressions of who he is. So each of us has been created to reflect his image as only we can. That's our uniqueness. That's our specialness. And there's nothing that we can do, and there's nothing that can happen to us from another person or another circumstance that takes away that unique way that we reflect the image of God.
Imagine there is a couple out there listening to this, and one of the spouses is evasive and maybe doesn't want to go deeper. And what does that person do if he or she doesn't agree to go to counseling? Like, how do you continue on in a relationship where you feel like you have needs that are unmet, but can't get the other person to maybe understand it or get help?
Good question.
There's a couple of different answers. Sometimes you can find if we're looking at, it's the wife that's wanting to come to counseling and the husband, that's not just a more common scenario, not always true, but the more common scenario. Find a man that the husband really respects and ask if they could be mentored by that couple. Get together for dinner once a month, just start spending some time with them. And typically that's an easier first step. The other approach is in that scenario where it's the wife who's wanting to work on it and the husband's resistant, is for the wife to come to counseling by herself. I've done a lot of good marriage counseling with just one person who was willing to work on the marriage, because marriage is a system, and you change one part of the system and it changes the marriage. Right. And
That's
so
really good.
To do that, and pretty frequently what I've discovered is if the wife will come or the husband will come for a few sessions by himself, the curiosity factor kicks in. The desire to come to the counselor and defend yourself.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm wondering.
What are you saying to him? I want to hear this.
Yeah. And typically I'll reach out with permission of the spouse that I'm seeing and saying, hey, your spouse is wanting to become a better spouse. And they've got some idea of what to work on, but it would be really helpful to hear from your perspective what they need to work on. And you invite them into the process as an ally, not as an adversary.
That's really good. Adam, I'm going to ask you this question. I wasn't planning to, but we continue to hear from listeners of, I live in such and such state. How do I find a counselor? Is there websites you would push them to, or how do they go about that?
The first step that I would recommend would be to call their church or one of the larger churches in the area to find out who are the counselors that they use. That's a good resource. Another resource is the American Association of Christian Counselors, maintains a database of counselors who've gone through a credentialing process. And you can go on there and search by zip code to find a counselor that's there. There's an organization called the Christian Association for Psychological Studies, which looks more at researchers and psychologists, but has some very good, very educated Christian counselors. That's CAPS.net and AACC.net. And they have databases that can be searched by individuals looking for someone from that perspective. The lesser known or lesser used resources in the Christian world is the Psychology Today website, Find a Therapist. And you can, in their search criteria, list Christian counselor. And then you have to be a little bit more careful about reading through the identifying information. I always suggest that you go through a counselor shopping appointment to let the counselor know, I'm trying to move into counseling to work on a particular area. And so what I want to know is, how would you approach this area? What are the tools that you use? What's your training? How do you integrate your faith? How important is your faith to the practice? If you have to choose between a biblical value and a psychological value, which one are you going to choose? Which one takes precedence? And ask those questions before you engage in a therapeutic relationship that becomes more difficult to manage. It's kind of like, you want to find out someone's a Christian before you start dating them, not after you've got connected.
Yes. Which is why calling a larger church or a more established church in the area might be a great start, just to say, who do you all use and refer people to? They've probably already done that vetting. So that's good, very practical.
Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, would you consider leaving us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show? It gives us insight into what you like, and it helps others find the show as well.
As you've listened today, we hope something has stood out to you that you'd like to share with a friend. Would you share this episode with them and boost the reach of the ministry? We appreciate you helping us get the conversations out into the world.
The Glass House is hosted by Lifeway, produced and edited by Angie Elkins Media, original music by Robert Elkins, sound engineering by Dale Sandberg, and artwork by Cameron Spooner.